also about addressing some of the challenges we have and making sure that as we start to create more robust identity solutions that can address cybercrime, that we also are designing solutions that work for everybody and are accessible for everybody. This has been a real challenge to date, and I think we certainly saw during the pandemic that one downside of government agencies rapidly deploying more robust ID verification tools was that in addition to blocking a lot of the attackers, it also put some people in a terrible situation where they couldn't convince agencies that they really were who they claimed to be. And most of the time through no fault of their own. And then they weren't able to get benefits that they badly needed and were entitled to during the pandemic. Not everybody has a smartphone. Not everybody has access to reliable broadband. Not everyone speaks English. Not everyone has a robust credit history. Not everyone has a driver's license or the other foundational credentials that are needed to prove who you are in both the physical and digital world. And so with all of these issues, there are some real limitations in terms of what the market can provide today when it comes to the digital identity solutions that we need to work for everybody. We can definitely do better. But as we'll talk about today, it's not just about industry coming up with better solutions or government creating new policies, or for that matter, government building its own systems to address the problem. Each of those can play some role in solving the identity and authentication conundrum, but a lot of our ability to make progress on this set of problems starts with a bigger issue, the recognition that identity is critical infrastructure and needs to be treated as such. Until we start to think about identity that way, we're going to continue to struggle to address challenges in this space. Now, we had a great win on this front earlier this year with Congressman Foster, who we'll hear from at lunch today, leading efforts to get language included in the Chips and Science Act that became law last year, directing NIST to take on some important new work here. It was a key part of the original Improving Digital Identity Act that he had introduced a couple years earlier, and it was basically peeled off this provision and included in the Chips and Science Act. Specifically, the bill now, or the law, directs NIST to expand the work it does in digital identity guidance, which to date's largely been focused on giving guidance to agencies who are trying to figure out who's who online if somebody's coming to do business with them. And this new guidance will also have to focus on helping government agencies know what they should do if they actually want to start providing their own identity and attribute validation services. Why does this matter? Well, today the authoritative issuers of identity are split between federal, state, and local levels. There's no guidance to set a high bar for security and privacy, say in the way that SSA might offer a digital service to validate an SSN, or the State Department to passport. No guidance to cover how a state DMV might create digital identity services tied to the driver's license, or how a local vital records bureau might create a digital birth certificate. So Section 10225 of the CHIPS Act now directs NIST to tackle this important work so that all of those agencies will have common standards. So while we still have a lot more work to do on the policy layer of digital identity, this new law at least provides a foundational piece. Let me now shift to give you a preview of today's event. So we'll start off today with an opening keynote from Jimmy Kirby, the Deputy Director of FinCEN, who will outline some of what they're seeing with regard to the outsized role identity plays in enabling massive crime in the financial services sector each year, as well as some thoughts on what to do about it. Our partners from the ID Theft Resource Center will then release their annual data breach report, talking about some of the trends of the last year in terms of where bad things happened and how and why, and setting the stage for what we might do about it. ITRC is going to drive a good chunk of the morning agenda from there. We'll have a panel discussing the rise in data breach alerts that don't actually alert consumers to much of anything, followed by a spotlight session that highlights research they led with a group called the Black Researchers Collective, looking at the impact of identity crimes across Black communities in the United States. From there, they'll continue their focus on the impact on victims. We'll have a fireside chat that features Jessica Roy, who's an LA Times reporter, who did some powerful work over the last year documenting her experiences as the victim of a complex identity fraud case with persistent thieves. Having spent a lot of the morning documenting the problems we have in this space and the impact they have on people, we'll then shift in the afternoon to talking about potential solutions. So after lunch, we'll be joined for a lunchtime keynote by Congressman Foster, who, as I noted earlier, has been one of the Hill's strongest voices in flagging the importance of the government prioritizing digital identity. I mentioned earlier the role he played in the CHIPS Act, getting legislation passed to supercharge NIST's efforts in this space. He also came really close to getting broader legislation passed, the Improving Digital Identity Act, passed into law. This would have codified the importance of digital identity into law in the US and also required the White House to launch a whole new, what I call a whole of government effort, focusing on closing the gap between physical and digital credentials. So he'll be talking about what we might expect to see this Congress. From there, we'll shift to a panel discussion looking at challenges we face addressing equity and bias concerns in identity proofing. This is an issue that's been getting a lot of attention over the last year with regard to government services, but it's something that's a challenge more broadly in the private sector as well. I think one of the things the panel will dive into is some of the actual science in terms of where we actually have bias challenges with different identity proofing tools. The term bias gets thrown around a lot, but depending on the technology being used, sometimes there's a problem, and sometimes the technology actually works pretty accurately and equitably for everybody. So I think the idea of grounding policy discussions on this issue in the science going forward is going to be an important issue in the year ahead. From there, we'll hear from Andrew Shikiar, the Executive Director of FIDO Alliance, who will give us some thoughts on the authentication front and things happening in the FIDO ecosystem, some predictions on the year ahead. And from there, we'll then have a panel looking at a new twist on the FIDO standards called passkeys, which are poised to let us finally replace passwords. I'm pretty excited about it. Replacing them with something that's both stronger and easier to use. And we'll have speakers from NIST, from Amazon, Google, and Microsoft on that panel. We'll then end the day with two more panels, one talking to some key players from Capitol Hill and the executive branch about what we need to do in 2023 to make better identity happen, with a focus on how we can close the gap between physical and digital credentials. And finally, a panel that I think will be very timely, given that today's the deadline for industry comments to the CFPB on their proposal outlining new proposed regulations governing consumers' access to and control over their financial data. It's an area where getting identity and authentication and authorization right is really critical, given how much of a high-value target financial data is, as well as the more basic need to let consumers decide on a granular basis what data of theirs they might actually want to share or might not want to share with third parties. And then once we're done around 4:30, we'll have a nice reception out in the lobby. You're all invited to join us. So with that, I now want to take a moment to introduce Jimmy Kirby, who's the Deputy Director at Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Thank you.